Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on, well, a mission of truly epic proportions, mapping out the entire history of Canada.
And that's not an exaggeration.
No, not at all. We aren't just summarizing a few centuries here. We are spanning millennia. It's a vast chronological journey from, the deep past of ice sheets and indigenous civilizations, all the way up to modern constitutional battles.
And that's a story of collision, of convergence, incredible resilience, and I think continuous negotiation.
That's the perfect word for it. Negotiation.
It is. But it's vital we start by adjusting the typical historical lens. When most people think of Canadian history, they often start with Europeans, maybe 1497 or 1608.
Or the Vikings, if they're really going back.
Right, maybe 1000 CE. But that approach, it fundamentally misses the point. The saga we're detailing today begins in the deep past. You had established complex nations already thriving across this continent for more than 12,000 years.
12,000 years. It's hard to even wrap your head around that time frame.
It is. And in that context, European contact wasn't a beginning. It was a profound and often deeply destabilizing interruption to an already ancient ongoing narrative.
Exactly. So our objective for you, the listener, isn't just to list off a bunch of dates. We want to follow that strict chronological path and really pull out the deep insights. We're going to move from glaciation to Viking settlements, Imperial wars, world conflicts that define sovereignty.
And finally, to those intricate political negotiations that really characterize the Canadian Federation today.
So let's jump right in. Part 1. The ancient peoples and those very first European encounters.
We have to begin with, well, the greatest geographical event of the deep past, the peopling of the Americas. It's a process that's tied inextricably to the melting and shifting of the last ice age.
And the evidence suggests this happened surprisingly early.
It does. Current archaeological and genetic evidence points to migration into the continent, likely across the Bering Strait, maybe as far back as 15,000 to 20,000 years ago.
Which is incredible. And the geography of what is now Canada essentially dictated how that could even happen. I mean, the sheer weight of ice literally blocked the most direct route for thousands of years.
Precisely. The timeline of glaciation is absolutely critical here. By about 21,000 years before the present, you had these two colossal ice sheets, the Cordilleran in the west and the Laurentide covering the east.
Yeah, and they joined up.
They coalesced just east of the Rocky Mountains, and that closed the central interior path, that famous ice-free corridor. But, and this is the key, the coastal narrative is entirely different.
Which supports that earlier migration theory.
Exactly. The coastal alpine glaciers started retreating around 19,000 years ago, making the Pacific coast ice-free and, theoretically passable by about 15,000 years ago. That central ice-free corridor only opened up much, much later. We're talking between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago.
So the focus really shifts to those early coastal migrations as the first way in.
That's where the evidence points.
Which means that by the time any Europeans sailed anywhere near this continent, indigenous nations had already been here adapting for well over 12,000 years. Their sheer diversity of these nations, it just speaks volumes about their adaptability.
The diversity is staggering. I mean, they adapted to every conceivable ecological zone. If you think about the Pacific Northwest, you have nations like the Haida and the Tlingit.
Right, with the cedar houses and totem poles.
Yes, and they used those abundant resources to build these highly stratified societies. They constructed great cedar plank houses, carved towering totem poles that functioned as, genealogical records, and they were masters of deep-sea navigation.
And then you contrast that with the interior. On the plains, you have nations like the Blackfoot and the Cree.
And they perfected these complex communal strategies for hunting bison. It all relied on a deep knowledge of migration patterns and intricate political organization to manage huge populations.
And then moving east into the woodlands, you get these powerful political entities.
Like the Iroquois Confederacy, a political union famed for its diplomacy, living in these large communal longhouses, and relying heavily on settled agriculture, the Three Sisters. Corn, beans, and squash.
And even further north, the Inuit, who mastered the most extreme climate imaginable.
Just ingenious. They created highly specialized tools like the kayak and the igloo, technology that was absolutely essential for survival.
It's so important to underscore that these were complex, fully formed nations. They had international trade networks, laws, governance systems. They weren't just, isolated groups wandering around.
Absolutely not. Their political sophistication often rivaled and sometimes even surpassed European models of the time. We see evidence of continent-wide trade.
Like the seashells.
Exactly. Atlantic seashells have been discovered deep in the prairies. That shows immense networks using sophisticated transportation like birch bark canoes along interconnected river systems. Their diplomacy was codified.
There's even a specific date for one of the major alliances, right?
Yes, the alliance between the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, which is known as the Council of Three Fires, was established in 796 CE.
796, centuries before any permanent European footprint. That just fundamentally challenges the whole narrative that diplomacy in North America began with European treaties.
It shows that European powers, when they finally arrived, had to contend with millennia-old international protocols and highly skilled political structures.
It's the difference between encountering a state and encountering a blank slate.
And they encountered states.
So that sets the deep past. Now let's transition to those original interrupters, the Norse. The first known Europeans to arrive, around 1000 CE.
Yes, the Norse seafarers, under Leif Erikson, sailed across the North Atlantic and established this brief presence they called Vinland.
And we know this is L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland.
Archaeologists are very confident about that link now. Their occupation was physically marked by the construction of these sod longhouses and, very significantly, the forging of iron nails. That's proof of European industrial presence.
But their stay was incredibly short, barely a decade.
It was. And their sagas tell the story of why it failed. You have relentless, harsh winters, enormous supply difficulties because of the distance from Greenland,
And conflict with the locals.
and repeated, often violent conflicts with the local inhabitants, likely the Beothuk, who the Norse called Skraelings. That lack of cooperation, coupled with just logistical overreach, meant the settlement was abandoned. It was just an archaeological footnote, until the Age of Discovery began centuries later.
Which sets the stage for the permanent claim. 5 centuries later, the drive for new trade routes brought explorers back.
The first claim was effectively staked in 1497. John Cabot, sailing for the English crown, reached the eastern coast, probably Newfoundland or Labrador.
And he was driven by fish, mostly?
The search for new fishing grounds and a westward passage, yes. And this marked England's initial sustained presence, primarily through that massive cod fishery that just exploded off the Grand Banks.
But it was the French who ultimately put the name Canada on the map.
That's right. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. He claimed the land in the Gaspé Peninsula for Francis I of France. The next summer, 1535, he sailed up the St. Lawrence River as far as the Lachine Rapids near present-day Montreal.
And that's where he gets the name.
Exactly. He famously named the region Canada, and he got the word from the Huron-Iroquoian word Canada, which means village or settlement.
But even with these bold claims, permanent settlement was elusive for another 6 decades.
Oh, the initial attempts were just fraught with failure. Cartier tried at Charlesbourg Royal in 1541. The Marquis de la Roche-Mizguet established a disastrous colony on Sable Island in 1598.
And Tadoussac failed at first, too.
François Gravé Dupont's venture at Tadoussac in 1600 also failed initially. And these failures, they underscored a very harsh reality. European technology alone wasn't enough.
You needed Indigenous cooperation.
Without sustained Indigenous cooperation and knowledge, the project of settling North America was simply untenable.
Which brings us to the 17th century, and the figure who finally made the dream of New France a reality. So we turn now to Samuel de Champlain. He seems to have understood that success relied on forming partnerships, not just staking claims.
Champlain was highly perceptive. He was a diplomat, a map maker, a leader. Arriving in 1603, his first crucial step was mapping the St. Lawrence and forging these powerful immediate alliances with the local Montagnais and Algonquin nations.
All directed against their Iroquoian rivals.
Precisely. And that strategic pact was formally sealed with the Tadoussac Treaty in 1603.
This diplomacy was then swiftly followed by the founding of Quebec City in 1608, the first permanent French settlement.
A fortified habitation, as he called it, strategically placed on the cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence. And the economy was driven almost instantly by one thing, the fur trade.
Beaver pelts.
Beaver pelts. This required the French Coureur des Bois to integrate deeply into the continent's existing indigenous trade networks. It was an economic system built on mutual, if sometimes strained, reliance.
So the French needed indigenous knowledge for survival and navigation.
And in exchange, indigenous allies gained access to European metal goods and, critically, firearms.
But that reliance immediately dragged the French into existing conflicts and dramatically escalated them. I'm talking about the Beaver Wars.
Yes. In 1609, Champlain personally joined a battle at Lake Champlain. He used French arquebuses, these early firearms, to devastating effect against the Mohawk warriors.
A huge shock to the system.
A massive shock. And that single action initiated a century of sustained conflict, the Beaver Wars, as the Iroquois Confederacy fought desperately against the French and their allies for control over fur territories.
So let's talk about the unique society that grew up around this trade. The French crown chartered the company of 100 associates to try and spur demographic growth. That didn't go so well.
It failed spectacularly. They were supposed to transport 4,000 settlers in exchange for a monopoly, but they only managed to bring in about 300 a year. The colony was chronically underpopulated.
So the crown had to step in directly.
Dramatically under Louis XIV. Between 1663 and 1673, the state sponsored the Filles du Roi, the king's daughters. They transported around 770 women to the colony with state-funded dowries to encourage rapid marriage and high birth rates.
And it worked.
It did. The effort successfully tripled the population to around 3,000 by 1666.
Now, the socio-economic structure of New France society was defined by the seigneurial system. This is a crucial distinction from what the British would later do.
It's the defining insight. The seigneuries were these feudal land grants along the St. Lawrence. Seigneurs recruited habitants, tenant farmers, mostly from Normandy and Poitou in France.
And this discouraged individual land ownership.
Completely. It favored a highly structured communal and, critically, a culturally conservative agrarian society centered around the parish and the church. This conservatism would make the French-speaking population fundamentally distinct from the entrepreneurial, individualistic settlement models later favored by the Loyalists.
So even though they were ruled by absolutist governor-generals like Frontenac from the Chateau St. Louis, the society itself was communally organized and resistant to change.
And small. By 1750, despite all the king's efforts, the population only reached about 55,000.
And that small, conservative population became a massive strategic liability when the inevitable Anglo-French imperial conflicts began to rage across North America.
This is the phase that marks the decline of New France, really starting with Queen Anne's War.
The conflicts were relentless.
They were. It began with King William's War. And while Frontenac managed to repel English invasions at Quebec, the subsequent Queen Anne's War was a catastrophe for France. It led directly to the pivotal Treaty of Utrecht in 1713.
That treaty fundamentally redrew the map. It was the beginning of the end for French imperial power here.
It was devastating. France was forced to cede Acadia, Newfoundland, and all its claims over Hudson's Bay to Great Britain. New France was effectively confined to the St. Lawrence Corps.
So, in response, France poured resources into fortifying what it had left, specifically Fort Louisbourg.
On Ile Royale, which we now call Cape Breton, Louisbourg was meant to be impregnable. A massive stone citadel built after 1713 to guard the approaches to the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
An expensive, monumental undertaking.
30 million livres. It was a major commercial center for the cod trade, but strategically it was designed to deny the British entry to the St. Lawrence. But it proved vulnerable.
It fell.
It fell to the British in 1745 during King George's War, and even though the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle returned it to France, the strategic balance had clearly, permanently shifted.
And local tensions in the Maritimes just immediately escalated after that.
Yes, you have Father Le Loutre's War, which erupted after the British founded Halifax, directly challenging French influence. Le Loutre forged an alliance of Malicete Acadians and Micmac against the British.
But the British won at Fort Beausejour.
They did, and Le Loutre's alliance was dislodged. And this set the stage for one of the most tragic and brutal acts in Canadian history, the Acadian Deportation.
What a grand arrangement.
Starting in 1755. The British saw the Acadians, French-speaking settlers who refused to swear unconditional loyalty to the British Crown, as a fifth column, a threat. Approximately 11,500 Acadians were forcibly expelled from Nova Scotia.
Homes burned, families separated. It was systematic.
It was a systematic cultural cleansing aimed at securing absolute demographic control. Many Acadians were dispersed throughout the American colonies, with some eventually finding refuge in Louisiana, where their descendants became known as the Cajuns.
And that brings us to the final fatal conflict, the 7 Years' War.
The French and Indian War, as it's known in America, the ultimate imperial struggle. Britain changed strategy under William Pitt the Elder, pouring in massive resources, and crucially, the Royal Navy imposed an impenetrable blockade, strangling New France's supplies.
So the fate of New France was really sealed in 1759.
It was. Fort Niagara had fallen, cutting off the west. The decisive blow came at the Battle of the Plains as Abraham. General James Wolfe successfully maneuvered his British forces onto the high ground outside Quebec City, forcing the French, under General Montcalm, into a pitched battle.
Both generals died.
Both died, but the British carried the day and captured the fortress. A French attempt to retake Quebec the following spring failed, and Montreal fell before the end of summer.
And the end result was the Treaty of Paris in 1763.
France officially surrendered its entire continental presence in Canada to Great Britain, retaining only the tiny fishing islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. This marked the complete end of the New France political project.
And the beginning of 118 years of British North America. But the British now owned a vast new territory, inheriting two massive, potentially hostile populations, 60,000 French Catholics and dozens of independent Indigenous nations. This sets the stage for a period of extreme constitutional and military tension.
Britain's first attempt to impose some kind of structure on this complex new reality was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And it was a real balancing act, a mixture of imposition and concession.
Right, it's trying to satisfy new Loyalist settlers, recognize Indigenous claims, and manage the French population all at the same time. How did it even attempt to do that?
Well, it established English civil law and mandated Protestant governance in the newly renamed province of Quebec, which initially excluded Catholics from public office. But, and this is the crucial part, it also drew a clear line along the Appalachian Mountains.
The Proclamation line.
Exactly, reserving all lands west of that line for Indigenous nations, stating that settlers could not claim these lands without a formal treaty with the Crown.
And this concession to Indigenous land rights was forced by immediate military reality, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The proclamation was a direct reaction to Pontiac's rebellion, which erupted that same year, 1763. Pontiac successfully united several nations, the Ojibwa, Potawatomi, Seneca, in a coordinated armed uprising against British forts.
They were frustrated by trade restrictions and encroachment after the French defeat.
Right, and this rebellion demonstrated Indigenous military power, compelling the British to acknowledge their sovereignty through the proclamation, even if settlers frequently ignored it.
So there's this contradiction. On one hand, they seem to respect Indigenous land rights, but on the other, they're imposing English law and Protestant governance on 60,000 French Catholics. How did they manage that?
It was a political tightrope. They managed the French population through accommodation, specifically with the Quebec Act of 1774, which guaranteed French civil law and allowed Catholics to hold office.
Which was partly designed to secure French loyalty during the escalating American Revolutionary tensions.
Precisely. And regarding Indigenous nations, diplomacy continued, with leaders often asserting their sovereignty directly over the Crown itself.
Can you give an example of that?
Certainly. You see Indigenous leaders asserting their rights directly to the Great Father, the King. Chief Pigwis of the Ojibwa, for instance, in the 1810s, clearly stated that even the king, while respected, was ultimately below the Great Spirit and could not claim the Spirit's lands as his own.
So a clear understanding of sovereignty that existed outside of British law.
An inherent one, yes.
Then the American Revolution creates another critical demographic and political turning point, the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists.
The Loyalists, fleeing the new United States, dramatically increased the English-speaking Protestant population. They settled primarily in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the western part of Quebec. And their demand for British-style governance led Britain to pass the Constitutional Act of 1791.
This is the act that formally divided the old province of Quebec.
Yes. It created Upper Canada English-speaking, Protestant, governed by British law, and Lower Canada French-speaking Catholic, maintaining French civil law.
And both got legislative assemblies.
A nod toward self-governance. But the critical power, the veto, and the administration remained firmly with the British-appointed governors. It was a compromise that set the colonies on two different cultural trajectories.
And this fragmented collection of colonies faced its existential test with the War of 1812.
Launched by the Americans over British support for Indigenous nations and naval blockades, yes. The survival of British North America was completely contingent on the strength of its alliances. Sir Isaac Brock, the military commander of Upper Canada, forged a crucial partnership with Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader.
And Tecumseh was seeking British backing for a sovereign Indigenous homeland in the Ohio Valley.
He was. And that alliance delivered Canada its first major victory. The American strategy called for three invasion prongs, but bold British Indigenous action countered them. In 1812, General Hull surrendered Fort Detroit to Brock and Tecumseh.
And sources from the era say that without Indigenous allies, Canada couldn't have been defended.
It's widely acknowledged. Tecumseh's military genius was the strategic advantage.
But the partnership was fatally short-lived.
Tragically, both Brock and Tecumseh were killed in subsequent battles. And crucially, the British, once the war was over, swiftly reneged on their promises to Tecumseh, giving away control of Indigenous lands. It created a deep wound and a distrust that persists today.
The war continued with intense focus on Upper Canada's supply lines, like the attack on Fort York.
April 27, 1813. 14 American warships attacked Fort York, the capital. The armory there held a massive stockpile. In the 19th century, losing such a centralized stockpile was potentially crippling. It was a war-winning asset.
This chapter is really defined by heroism and alliances on the ground, like the famous story of Laura Secord.
Laura Secord is noted as a hero who took necessary action. She walked miles to warn the British. But her action was only successful because of the Indigenous component. She worked with John Tutela and his warriors, who successfully ambushed the Americans near Beaver Dams.
So that local Indigenous settler alliance was the tactical key that saved the Niagara Peninsula.
It was. The war ended with the Treaty of Ghent securing unhindered Western expansion for the U.S., while Canada seemed restricted to the north. But Canada had successfully defended itself, solidifying a negative identity. We are not American.
After the war, settled life spread, driven by agriculture and the burgeoning lumber trade. But there were trade troubles.
Canada hoped American goods transshipped through Montreal would get British tariff preferences, but London refused. The St. Lawrence route had to compete solely on its natural advantages.
And these economic frustrations, combined with a lack of true representative government, culminated in the rebellions of 1837 and 1838.
Yes, these uprisings were fundamentally about class and power. In Upper Canada, the governing elite, the Family Compact, controlled everything, excluding reformers. The rebellions were unsuccessful militarily, but they forced Britain to finally review its colonial administration.
Which brought Lord Durham and his famous report.
And Durham recommended two huge shifts. First, responsible government, where the executive would be accountable to the elected assembly. And second, the union of Upper and Lower Canada, which he hoped would assimilate the French population.
And those recommendations set the stage for the next phase of nation building.
So the 1840s and 50s saw the creation of the United Province of Canada, but the atmosphere remained defined by American economic and political ambition.
Yeah.
The annexation debate was very real.
Oh, yeah. You had U.S. senators like Seward openly describing Canada as a food ready to drop into the American basket. But Southern U.S. politicians were actually afraid that union with Canada would strengthen the anti-slavery North.
It complicated the American political calculus. So Lord Elgin, the Governor-General, sought this brilliant, pragmatic solution, the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854.
His argument was that a Canada fattened by reciprocity would stay independent.
Exactly. An economically secure Canada would have less reason to seek annexation, whereas a starving one would leap at the chance. And the treaty significantly boosted north-south trade, especially lumber.
But at the same time, the rise of railways exposed these massive geographic problems for this long, skinny country.
The railways, though essential, often just channeled Canadian resources and traffic south to U.S. ports like Boston and Portland, draining commerce away from the St. Lawrence.
Which led to this almost obsessive political drive to build an intercolonial railway from Quebec to Halifax.
To link the vigorous maritime colonies firmly to the Canadian core, yes.
But the real catalyst for Confederation in the 1860s wasn't some grand ideal. It was fear and necessity.
It was a pragmatic crisis solution. The American Civil War bred a dangerous mood of northern expansionism, and then you had the Irish-American Fenian attacks across the border.
They were trying to seize Canadian territory to hold Britain hostage.
And this just amplified Canadian vulnerability. In 1860, British North America had fewer than 5,000 regular troops. Their military weakness was obvious.
So Confederation became the necessary solution to political deadlock, economic challenges, and military vulnerability.
Yes. The elites, bound by the need for stability, moved quickly. And French Canadians saw the Union as a practical way to protect their legal and religious systems within a federal structure. This all culminated in the British North America Act of 1867.
Establishing the Dominion of Canada, the initial 4 provinces were Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick.
And we have to emphasize the B&A Act's foundational element, the role of the Crown. Section 9 explicitly vests executive authority in the monarch.
It's not just symbolic.
It's not. The Crown is the keystone of the constitutional architecture, legally linking the federal government and the provinces into a single constitutional unit. It's what allows the system of divided powers to function.
And the Dominion immediately began expanding westward.
In 1870, the massive Northwest Territories were transferred from the Hudson's Bay Company, and out of that, Manitoba was created, the first province established solely by the Canadian Parliament.
British Columbia joined in 1871 on the promise of a transcontinental railway.
Prince Edward Island followed in 1873. Later, the Yukon Territory in 1898, and finally, Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905, establishing the Canada we largely recognize today.
And at the same time, external threats began to recede, which was crucial for Canada's future independence.
The Treaty of Washington in 1871 was indispensable. It settled boundary disputes, confirmed the undefended frontier, and paved the way for Anglo-American reconciliation. That peace was the absolute precondition for Canada to later achieve full autonomy.
But while the map was filling out, internal social struggles, particularly regarding race and immigration, were casting a long shadow.
The early history is marred by systematic racial discrimination. A clear example is the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which specifically targeted and limited Chinese immigration.
And much later, during World War II, the Japanese-Canadian community would face the horrific, systematic confiscation of their property and internment.
A deep scar on the nation's human rights record. On the other hand, Indigenous nations continued their high-level diplomacy with the Crown, often bypassing the Canadian government to seek redress directly from the sovereign.
Right, like Nana Wekwai of the Ojibwa securing an audience with Queen Victoria in 1860.
This continuity is important. The tradition of the Indian Chief's Medal to commemorate treaties reinforced that perceived nation-to-nation relationship that many First Nations maintained with the sovereign even after Confederation.
The 20th century begins with Canada thrust onto the global stage. 2 world wars that would ultimately define its sovereignty and national confidence in a way constitutional acts alone never could. Let's start with World War I.
Canada's readiness for the war, or lack thereof, immediately revealed major logistical challenges. Notably, the search for a standard-issue infantry rifle led to the adoption of the Ross rifle in 1901.
Championed by the controversial Minister of Militia and Defense, Sam Hughes.
A very energetic but often controversial figure, yes. And the Ross rifle quickly became notorious in the trenches.
It had a tendency to jam.
A critical tendency to jam after repeated firings in the mud. It was longer, heavier, and more expensive than the British Lee Enfield. The troops themselves paid the price for that logistical error.
But Sam Hughes was instrumental in mobilizing the country.
He was a force of nature. He created the world's largest ever volunteer army at the time. And he controversially bypassed the established military hierarchy, promoting men he trusted, like Arthur Currie.
Who lacked European military experience and only had a high school diploma.
A promotion based on merit and local knowledge, rather than aristocracy. Something utterly unique in the Allied armies at the time.
The early battles were just brutalizing, but formative.
The Second Battle of Ypres was Currie's first direct combat experience. Then the Battle of the Somme, a bloodbath of attrition, saw 8,000 Canadians killed and 17,000 wounded for almost no gain.
And yet this brutal schooling led directly to Canada's defining military moment, Vimy Ridge.
The assault on Vimy Ridge in April 1917 is the central insight of Canada's WWI experience. German forces considered the ridge impregnable. But the key thing for the listener to understand is that Vimy was the first time all 4 Canadian divisions fought together under a unified Canadian command.
That coordination, instead of being parceled out to British commanders, was revolutionary.
It was. And the success came down to an almost unprecedented level of planning and tactical innovation. They used replica trenches for rehearsals, detailed models, and a key tactic involved the 3rd Division, using 2 large tunnels to emerge behind the 4 defenses and achieve total surprise.
The victory was rapid and complete.
By 1:30 p.m. on the day of the assault, the 4 Canadian divisions had completed their main objectives. The strategic achievement wasn't just territory, it was the creation of a national military identity separate from Britain.
A moment of profound nationhood, later memorialized by the 1936 Vimy pilgrimage.
It was. And following the war, this newfound independence translated into legislative action with the Statute of Westminster in 1931.
Which granted Canada and other dominions full legislative sovereignty.
They could manage their own foreign affairs. But there was a crucial dependency that remained. The core constitutional document, the B&A Act, was excluded. It remained locked in London until 1982.
So when World War II broke out, Canada immediately exercised its new autonomy.
Prime Minister Mackenzie King called a parliamentary vote, and Canada formally declared war on Germany on its own terms on September 10, 1939. It wasn't automatic like in 1914.
A symbolic, definitive act of independence. And the scale of Canada's war effort was enormous.
Over 1 million Canadians served. Canada emerged with the third largest navy and the fourth largest air force among the Allies. Key campaigns included the tragic Dieppe raid, the invasion of Sicily, and the D-Day landings at Juno Beach.
And the Italian campaign deserves special recognition for its strategic importance.
It was the longest continuous campaign fought by the Canadian Army in the war. Its strategic goal wasn't rapid victory, but rather successfully tying down 30 to 40 highly capable German divisions, preventing them from being redeployed to crucial fronts like Normandy.
So, post-war, Canada emerged with high national confidence.
Absolutely. Actively participating in establishing the United Nations and NATO and defining its modern identity as a leading middle power and a key peacekeeping nation.
The 1960s usher in the modern era, beginning with profound domestic change in Quebec and the arrival of a leader who would dominate Canadian politics for 2 decades, Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
The Quiet Revolution in Quebec marked a seismic shift. It was a rapid period of secularization and modernization, where the provincial state took over fields traditionally held by the Catholic Church: health, education, social services.
And this fostered a secular nationalist movement.
It did. And then, in 1968, Trudeau-mania swept Pierre Trudeau into power. His mission was to centralize power in Ottawa, unify the country, and build a modern state rooted in individual rights, bilingualism, and multiculturalism.
His first major test came quickly, in 1970, with the October Crisis.
Following bombings and the kidnapping of a British diplomat by the radical FLQ, Trudeau invokes the War Measures Act, the only time it's ever been used in peacetime.
His famous line, "Just watch me."
An unprecedented act that remains highly controversial for the mass arrests that followed. But Trudeau's government went on to fundamentally redefine Canadian identity through policy.
Moving away from a primarily British heritage.
He established official bilingualism and, crucially, introduced multiculturalism as official state policy in the early 1970s. This was a defining moment, shifting Canadian identity toward an acceptance of multiple cultural origins as a core national attribute.
This era also saw major reforms to eliminate explicit racial discrimination in immigration.
Yes, new regulations in 1962, and then the points system in 1967 formally eliminated overt racial bias. Selection was supposedly based on skill and education. However,
The sources say subtle bias persisted.
they do. Scholars note this through the geographical distribution of immigration offices and the inherent preference in the points system for candidates from developed, predominantly white countries.
Meaning the system was still managing class and origin, even if not explicitly managing race?
Exactly. And concurrently, you see growth in temporary migrant worker programs, often of racialized workers, which existed outside the permanent points-based system.
Trudeau's crowning achievement came in the 1980s, the Patriation of the Constitution.
The culmination of his life's work. After the sovereigntist Parti Québécois lost the first referendum in 1980, Trudeau moved to bring the legal documents home.
And he did this largely unilaterally without Quebec's signature.
It was a unilateral move, yes. The process culminated on April 17, 1982, when Queen Elizabeth II proclaimed the Constitution Act 1982 into law. The British Parliament renounced its remaining jurisdiction. Canada was finally fully sovereign constitutionally,
And that act enshrined the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
which placed a strong focus on individual rights and fundamentally changed Canadian constitutional law by making rights supreme over ordinary legislation.
Since Quebec objected, the following decade was defined by frustrating attempts at constitutional accommodation under Prime Minister Brian Mulroney.
Mulroney tried with the Meech Lake Accord in 1987, which aimed to recognize Quebec as a distinct society. It famously failed in 1990 because it couldn't get unanimous provincial consent.
And that failure had immense political fallout.
Crucial fallout. It polarized the country. It led directly to the formation of the Bloc Québécois federally and the rise of the Reform Party in the West. And we have to note the pivotal role played by Indigenous leader Elijah Harper, who helped ensure the Accord's defeat.
The final grand attempt was the Charlottetown Accord in 1992.
An all-encompassing deal, but it failed dramatically in a public national referendum. And these accumulated failures set the fuse for the second, incredibly close Quebec referendum.
The Quebec Referendum of 1995. The fate of the country hanging by a thread.
The intensity was unprecedented, 93.5% voter turnout. And ultimately, sovereignty was rejected by the narrowest of margins, 50.6% voting no to 49.4% voting yes.
A difference of just over 50,000 votes. The psychological impact of that 1% margin was enormous.
It forced immediate political action from Ottawa. The Supreme Court ruled in 1997 that unilateral secession would be unconstitutional. Parliament then passed the Clarity Act, setting the legal standard for any future referendum.
And a related, highly complex sovereignty conflict emerged within Quebec itself, involving Indigenous nations.
This is the ultimate nation of many nations conflict. The claim of Quebec secessionists to territorial integrity was directly challenged by the pre-existing sovereignty claims of the Cree and Inuit within the province.
A profound, unresolved conflict over territory and governance.
Exactly. Moving to another essential element of modern Canada, the painful, ongoing process of reconciliation regarding the residential school system.
Managed by Indian Affairs and various churches, involving the forced removal of over 150,000 Indigenous children.
Resulting in immense suffering and intergenerational trauma. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created to document the truth through survivor testimony.
And a major symbolic step was taken in 2008.
On June 11, 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper delivered a formal apology on behalf of the government, stating clearly that the attitudes that inspired the system must never again prevail. But reconciliation remains an ongoing generational project.
Let's turn to social governance, specifically universal healthcare, Medicare, a defining feature of Canadian identity.
Born in Saskatchewan in 1947, it was standardized by the Canada Health Act of 1984. Its principle is that access should be based on need, not ability to pay.
Yet the system is notoriously complex because it's so decentralized.
It is. It's a collection of provincial and territorial insurance plans covering a narrow basket of services. This complexity means that while the core principle of equity exists, the system faces chronic challenges like long wait times and profound health inequities for Indigenous populations.
Finally, let's bring the timeline right up to the present day with the monarchy and federalism.
After Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, King Charles III was proclaimed Canada's new head of state. This transition highlighted the persistent constitutional tension in Quebec, where the mandatory oath to the king for politicians was ultimately ended by Quebec legislation.
And we have to mention the economic mechanism that underlies the Federation: equalization payments.
One of the most contentious elements. This system distributes federal tax money among the provinces to ensure comparable levels of public services. It's perpetually debated.
Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan are typically have provinces and receive none.
And due to its large population, Quebec receives more than half the total money distributed, even though smaller Atlantic provinces get higher amounts per capita.
That economic debate, along with constitutional failures and Indigenous conflicts, really defines a country that is constantly negotiating its very existence.
Our journey today has been, well, long and complex. From the ancient migration routes defined by glaciation to the Plains of Abraham, from the strategic failure of the Ross Rifle to the individual rights in the Charter.
And what defines that entire 15,000-year narrative arc is that continuous thread of negotiation, collision, and compromise.
It is a history characterized by a highly complex federal structure. I mean, this constant division of powers is everywhere.
Right. The federal government determines criminal procedure, but the provinces organize the courts and police. Ottawa defines the concept of marriage, but the provinces control the solemnization of those marriages.
This system of 11 crowns is the mechanism that allows this immensely diverse arrangement to function, trying to manage conflicts from fiscal redistribution to Indigenous land rights, all under the umbrella of a single, highly decentralized state.
So as we conclude this comprehensive deep dive, we'll leave you with this provocative thought. Given the persistence of sovereignty movements in Quebec, the unresolved conflict between Indigenous self-determination and territorial integrity, and the constant debates over the structure of federalism, what key issue originating in this vast timeline of negotiation and compromise do you believe Canada must resolve next to definitively fulfill its identity as a nation of many nations?